April 7th, 1994, Memphis, Tennessee. One pilot, 4 hammers, a spear gun, and a $2.5 million life insurance policy. And the craziest part? He wasn't trying to escape, he was trying to die. A FedEx flight engineer attacked his own crew with hammers at 18,000 feet, then tried to crash the plane into the FedEx headquarters. But this isn't just about a hijacking. It's about 3 crew members who fought back with fractured skulls and severed arteries. A Navy pilot who flew a cargo plane upside down at 860 kilometers per hour, and a 60-second scheduling coincidence that put a 3rd man on board. Callaway was a Stanford graduate, a black belt, a Navy pilot. He had everything planned, except the crew. This is how a father's $2.5 million insurance scheme became the most violent hijacking in American aviation history. Auburn Callaway had a good life once, but it didn't last. His family was not rich, but Callaway worked his way into Stanford University, one of the most prestigious institutions in the country. He majored in African and African American studies. He was disciplined, intelligent, and driven. After graduation, he joined the United States Navy. He became a talented pilot, earning his wings and flying missions that demanded precision and composure under pressure. He started a family, 2 children, a wife, a home. For a while, the American dream was working exactly the way it was supposed to. But when his military career came to an end, the transition to civilian life proved far more difficult than Callaway had anticipated. He applied for a pilot position at Federal Express. FedEx was growing rapidly in the early 1990s, expanding its fleet and hiring qualified aviators. Callaway had the credentials, Navy training, combat experience, thousands of flight hours. But they didn't offer him a pilot seat. They offered him a lower-paying position as a flight engineer, the 3rd seat in the cockpit, the one with the least authority, the least prestige, and the least pay. Why would FedEx pass over a Navy-trained pilot for the captain's chair? Callaway believed the answer was racial discrimination. He was African American, and he was convinced the company had placed him in a lesser role because of his race. But he didn't file a complaint. He didn't make noise. He needed the job. He had a family to support, 2 children who depended on him. That resentment, quiet at first, buried beneath professionalism and daily routine, would grow into something no one around him saw coming. Every morning he walked into that cockpit and sat in the 3rd chair. Every morning he watched captains and first officers, some with less experience than him, fly the aircraft while he managed systems and gauges. Every morning that gap between what he believed he deserved and what he'd been given ate away at him a little more. What does that kind of slow-burning resentment do to a person over years? What happens when a man who was trained to fly combat missions for the United States Navy spends every workday in a seat he considers an insult? This is where his life began spiraling out of control. Callaway was clearly unhappy working for FedEx. The gap between what he believed he deserved and what he'd been given widened every year. After a few years, he and his wife got divorced. Although his job didn't pay enough to send their 2 children to college, he was still supporting them financially, still showing up for shifts, still trying to hold things together with a career he resented and a paycheck that wasn't enough. How does a decorated military pilot go from Stanford to a cockpit he feels he doesn't belong in? And what happens when the last thread holding that life together finally snaps? Then, in early 1994, FedEx made a discovery that ended everything. When Callaway had first applied for the job years earlier, he had exaggerated the number of flight hours on his resume. It was a common practice in aviation, but it was also the kind of lie that ends careers permanently. Falsified records. In an industry built on trust and precision, there's no coming back from that. Callaway was sure the company would fire him. A disciplinary hearing was scheduled for April 8, 1994. He knew what the outcome would be. Before this, Callaway thought he couldn't adequately support his children's education. Now his career was over entirely. His marriage was gone. His professional reputation was destroyed. He was, in his own mind, completely useless to his children, unless he died. As a Federal Express employee, Callaway was entitled to a life insurance policy worth $2.5 million in the event of his death during a work-related accident. $2.5 million. That money would guarantee college tuition, financial security, and a future for his 2 children. everything he couldn't provide while alive. Would a father really kill himself and 3 other men so his children could collect insurance money? The note he left behind answers that question. And so Callaway prepared a plan. The day before his disciplinary hearing, he would smuggle 4 hammers, a knife, and a spear gun onto a FedEx flight. He would attack the crew from behind, take control of the aircraft, and crash it. When investigators examined the wreckage, the blows from the hammers would be indistinguishable from injuries caused by the crash itself. It would appear to be a tragic mechanical failure, an accident. His family would receive the $2.5 million, and nobody would ever know the truth. The plan was meticulous, cold, calculated down to every single detail, including the weapon choice. Hammers, because they leave blunt force trauma consistent with crash injuries. A spear gun as backup. The cockpit voice recorder would be turned off, so there would be no audio evidence. Every detail designed to erase the truth. But the plan depended on one critical assumption, that the crew would go down quickly, that 2 people, a captain and a first officer, couldn't stop a 6'2" black belt armed with hammers and a spear gun. On his original crew, he might have been right. The original crew was smaller, 2 people instead of 3. But something happened the day before the flight that Callaway couldn't have predicted, something that would change everything. Callaway was originally scheduled to operate FedEx Flight 705 from Memphis to San Jose on April 7, 1994. He was the assigned flight engineer, but the day before, his crew exceeded their daily allowed flying time. Not by hours, not by 30 minutes, by 1 single minute, 60 seconds. What are the odds of that? 1 minute, 60 seconds. The difference between Callaway facing 2 crew members or 3. That 1 minute meant another crew would have to operate the flight. Captain David Sanders, First Officer James Tucker, Flight Engineer Andrew Peterson. 3 men who were never supposed to be on that airplane. But Callaway had to be on that flight. His disciplinary hearing was the next morning. This was his only window. FedEx had a policy that allowed employees to hitch rides with other crews for free. It was a common perk in the cargo airline industry. Pilots, engineers, and other staff regularly jumped on flights heading to their next assignment or commuting home. Nobody questioned it. Nobody checked bags. There was no passenger screening for crew members riding deadhead. Callaway exploited this policy. He boarded the plane as a deadhead passenger, someone who sits quietly outside the cockpit while the crew flies the plane. Instead of his original crew of 2, he would now face 3 crew members, all men, all trained. One of them, James Tucker, was a former Navy fighter pilot with combat experience. Tougher, more dangerous. But Callaway was determined. He had already decided to die. On the morning of April 7, 1994, Callaway left his will on his bed. He packed his weapons into a standard travel bag and a guitar case. He carried a note for his ex-wife that read, in part, "I would much rather go on a date, time, place, and method of my own choosing. I resolved some time ago that the next time my security and future is threatened, it's my time to go, fighting." Remember that note. It tells you everything about what was coming next. A man who has already decided to die is about to board a cargo plane with hammers and a spear gun. He's facing 3 crew members instead of 2. One of them is a Navy combat pilot. Think he pulls it off? Drop your prediction in the comments and hit subscribe. What happens at 18,000 feet will shock you. Federal Express transports goods, not people. Their flight crews typically consist of 2 pilots, a captain and a first officer. But during the 1990s, most commercial aircraft still required a 3rd crew member to operate, a flight engineer. That was Callaway's role, the one he resented. The aircraft assigned to Flight 705 was a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, one of the workhorses of the FedEx fleet, a massive 3-engine freighter capable of carrying over 150,000 pounds of cargo across the country in a single trip. The DC-10 was designed for endurance and reliability, not agility. It was built to fly straight and level at cruising altitude, not to perform combat maneuvers. That distinction would matter enormously in the next half hour. Memphis International Airport was the nerve center of the entire FedEx operation. Every night, hundreds of aircraft converged on Memphis, unloaded their packages, sorted them through the massive hub facility, and flew them back out before dawn. The FedEx headquarters building sat right on the airport property. Thousands of employees worked there around the clock. It was the beating heart of a global logistics empire, and it was, according to investigators, Callaway's intended target. Federal Express Flight 705 took off from Memphis International Airport at 3 p.m. on April 7, 1994. Clear skies, perfect conditions for a routine cargo flight to San Jose, California. The DC-10 freighter was loaded with packages, not passengers. Just the 3 crew members and 1 deadhead passenger sitting quietly behind them. Callaway was the first to board. He brought his travel bag and guitar case. When Peterson arrived, he thought nothing of it. FedEx employees jumped on flights every day. But Peterson noticed something strange. The cockpit voice recorder was in the off position. He flipped it back on. That instinct to restore the recorder would prove to be one of the most important decisions made that day. Without the cockpit voice recording, investigators would have had only the crew's testimony to reconstruct the events. With it, they had audio evidence of the entire attack, the radio calls, and the desperate fight for survival at 18,000 feet. Sanders and Tucker arrived, said hello to Callaway, prepared the cockpit. They didn't close the door. There was no reason to. He was a colleague. At approximately 18,000 feet, 26 minutes after takeoff, Callaway opened his guitar case. He pulled the spear gun out, loaded it, picked up 2 hammers. 3:26 p.m. Callaway struck Peterson multiple times from behind. The blows were devastating. Peterson's temporal artery was severed instantly. He began bleeding out. As Tucker turned to see what was happening, Callaway swung a hammer into the left side of his head. Fragments of Tucker's skull pierced the left side of his brain. The right side of his body began going paralyzed. Finally, Callaway turned to Sanders. The captain tried to defend himself but was overpowered. Severe gashes across his head, his ear nearly torn off completely. All 3 crew members were in excruciating pain, extremely disoriented, bleeding heavily from wounds that would have incapacitated most people instantly. Peterson's temporal artery, one of the major blood vessels supplying the brain, was pumping blood out of his body with every heartbeat. Tucker had bone fragments pressing into his brain tissue. Sanders could feel his ear hanging by a strip of skin. But all 3 were still alive, still conscious, still capable of fighting back. And that was the one thing Auburn Callaway had not planned for. His entire scheme depended on incapacitating the crew with the first strikes. Quick, devastating, final. But 3 men are harder to kill than 2, especially when one of them is a Navy combat pilot. What if even one of them had lost consciousness? What if Peterson's artery had bled faster? What if Tucker's skull fracture had been slightly deeper? Callaway went back to the galley for the spear gun. While he retrieved it, the crew had a few precious moments to recover, seconds that felt like hours. Sanders undid his seatbelt and stumbled toward the door. Peterson, bleeding heavily from his severed artery, managed to push himself upright. Tucker, fighting through the disorientation of a skull fracture, gripped the flight controls and tried to assess the situation. When Callaway returned, he was holding the spear gun, a weapon designed to fire a steel-tipped projectile with enough force to penetrate a wetsuit and the flesh beneath it. At close range, inside an aircraft cabin, it was lethal. He pointed it directly at Sanders. "Sit down. Get back in your seat. This is a real gun. I'll kill you." For a fraction of a second, time stopped in that cabin. 3 injured men staring at a spear gun held by a man who had nothing to lose. A man who had already decided to die today. What do you do when you're looking at a weapon held by someone who doesn't care if he lives or dies? Peterson saw the gun and seized the opportunity. He grabbed the spear before Callaway could pull the trigger. Sanders rushed forward, and Tucker, still at the controls, realized he was sitting behind the most powerful weapon on the aircraft, the plane itself. 3:28 p.m. Tucker pulled back the yoke. The DC-10 pitched up 15 degrees. The sudden slope threw Callaway, Peterson, and Sanders through the cockpit door into the galley. The fight for their lives had officially begun. Tucker was flying manually, fractured skull, brain injury, right side of his body going numb. His right hand was weakening, his right leg was losing sensation. The paralysis was creeping through his body in real time, and he knew it. Every minute that passed, he had less control over his own muscles. But James Tucker was not an ordinary pilot. Before FedEx, he had flown combat missions for the United States Navy. He had been trained to operate aircraft under extreme duress, to make decisions when the instruments were screaming, the airframe was shaking, and the margin for error was measured in seconds. That training was about to save 3 lives. Tucker made a decision that would have been unthinkable to any civilian pilot. He decided to use the DC-10 itself as a weapon against Callaway. If he couldn't fight the man physically, he would fight him with physics. G-forces, disorientation, the raw, violent mathematics of a 160-ton aircraft being thrown through maneuvers it was never designed to perform. He rolled the DC-10 left by 140 degrees, almost completely inverted. A cargo freighter, designed to carry packages across the country, was now flying nearly upside down over rural Arkansas. The fight in the galley was now happening on the ceiling. Callaway, Sanders, and Peterson were tumbling through a cabin that had become a centrifuge. But the maneuver also hurt Sanders and Peterson. They were both losing blood, getting weaker with every passing second. During the chaos, Callaway struck Sanders again. In the cockpit, Tucker's paralysis was spreading through his right side, but he made a decision that no pilot had ever made before. He sent the DC-10 into a vertical nosedive. The speedometer topped out at 860 kilometers per hour. The needle was pinned, but the plane was going much faster than the instruments could measure. The DC-10's maximum operating speed had been exceeded by a massive margin. The airframe was shaking. The control surfaces were buffeting. Every rivet in the fuselage was being tested against forces the engineers at McDonnell Douglas never intended the aircraft to experience. No DC-10 had ever flown at this speed. The aircraft was never designed for these maneuvers. The elevator wings began shaking uncontrollably. If Tucker didn't slow down, or if he leveled off too quickly, the plane would disintegrate mid-air. Was Tucker trying to pin Callaway to the floor with G-forces? Was he trying to make it impossible for anyone to stand? Or was he simply fighting with the only weapon he had left, knowing his body was failing him? 3:31 p.m. Tucker radioed Memphis. Emergency. Express 705. I've been wounded. We've had an attempted takeover on board the airplane. Give me a vector, please. Back to Memphis. At this time. Hurry. Tucker could hear the fighting behind him getting worse. He requested ambulances. Then he made a request that tells you exactly how serious the situation had become. Armed intervention. It is the most grave request a pilot can make. It means there is an active threat on board the aircraft. It means when this plane lands, it needs to be met by armed personnel prepared to use lethal force. SWAT teams, firemen, and ambulances began mobilizing at Memphis International Airport. Meanwhile, in the galley, the fight was reaching its climax. Sanders gathered his remaining strength, took one of Callaway's own hammers, and struck him with it. Twice. Then again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they managed to pin him to the floor. 2 severely injured men holding down a 6'2" black belt who was still fighting, still struggling, still trying to reach his weapons. Sanders called Tucker to the galley. Tucker put the plane on autopilot and limped over. The galley was destroyed. His crewmates were drenched in blood. Callaway was pinned beneath them. For the first time in 16 minutes, the fighting stopped. Sanders took all of Callaway's weapons and returned to the cockpit. He radioed Memphis approach for landing instructions. Sanders was alone in the cockpit, bleeding, his ear dangling, his jaw likely broken. Every warning system in the aircraft screaming at him. Could he actually land this aircraft? The DC-10 was over 16 tons above the recommended landing weight, most of it fuel. Normally, planes dump fuel before emergency landings, but Sanders couldn't safely reach the dump switches. He would have to land overweight, which risked the tires exploding on contact with the ground. At around 7,000 feet, Sanders heard the fight intensifying again from the galley. Callaway was still struggling. Sanders made a hard decision. He leveled the airplane, placed it on autopilot, and went back to the galley, prepared to kill Callaway if necessary. By the time he arrived, Tucker had pinned him down again. But those few seconds on autopilot had made landing on runway 9 impossible. The plane had maintained speed and altitude while nobody was flying it. Sanders scanned his instruments and made a split-second decision. He chose runway 36 left. It was longer than runway 9, which gave him more room to stop the overweight aircraft, but it was perpendicular to his current heading. He was pointing east. The runway pointed north. Getting lined up would require aggressive maneuvering that would test both the aircraft and the injured pilot flying it. To land safely, he would have to turn 90 degrees right, execute a sharp 180-degree turn while descending rapidly, land the DC-10 smoothly enough not to blow any tires, and bring 160 tons of aircraft to a complete stop before reaching the end of the runway. Any one of those steps could go wrong. Turn too sharply and the overweight aircraft could stall, descend too fast and he wouldn't be able to level off in time, touch down too hard and the tires would explode under the excess weight, sending the DC-10 skidding off the runway. Come in too fast and he'd run out of concrete before the plane stopped. These maneuvers would challenge a healthy pilot in a light aircraft on a calm day. For an injured man with a dangling ear, a dislocated jaw, blood obscuring his vision, and warning systems screaming in his ears, they were nearly impossible. But there was no alternative. No one else could fly the plane. No one was coming to help. It was David Sanders, alone in the cockpit, or nobody. In the galley, Callaway made one last desperate attempt. He reached for a hammer lying on the floor. Peterson, who had lost so much blood that his pulse was barely detectable, who had been fighting for 16 minutes with a severed artery, who by every medical measure should have been unconscious, grabbed it first. Gathering every last ounce of strength remaining in his body, he struck Callaway for the final time, stunning him for good. 3:42 p.m. Captain David Sanders landed the DC-10 without blowing a single tire. He brought it to a halt with barely 300 meters of runway remaining, 16 minutes after the first hammer strike, the longest 16 minutes in the history of Federal Express. The emergency response team rushed the aircraft from every direction: fire trucks, ambulances, armed SWAT officers. The first thing they did when they reached the plane was place Auburn Callaway in handcuffs. Peterson was evacuated first. He barely had a pulse. Tucker had to be carried down from the aircraft. Sanders shared an ambulance with him. Callaway was taken to the same hospital, tightly restrained in his stretcher. He had failed. The three men he tried to kill were alive. The plane he tried to crash had landed safely. The insurance policy that was supposed to provide for his children would never pay out. And the career he was trying to escape from was now the least of his problems. He would never see freedom again. Auburn Callaway was charged with attempted aircraft piracy. He pleaded temporary insanity. The jury rejected his defense. He was found guilty and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences in a federal prison without the possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated to this day. Does Callaway regret what he did? Does he think about the 3 men whose lives he permanently altered? Those questions remain unanswered. He has granted no interviews from prison. Several people, including members of the crew, believe Callaway intended to crash the DC-10 directly into the FedEx headquarters building at Memphis International Airport, taking countless lives on the ground, doing untold damage to the company he blamed for destroying his career. 7 years before September 11, 2001, before the world understood what a weaponized aircraft looked like, before reinforced cockpit doors became standard, before aviation security was transformed by tragedy, a man in Memphis, Tennessee tried to use a commercial aircraft as a weapon, and 3 wounded crew members stopped him with their bare hands at 18,000 feet. Tucker needed 3 major operations and 2.5 years of intensive therapy to relearn how to walk and talk. Peterson nearly died from blood loss on the runway. Sanders' injuries were permanent and debilitating. No one from the crew was ever medically fit to fly again. Their careers in aviation ended on that runway in Memphis. 3 professional pilots who had dedicated their lives to flying would never sit in a cockpit again. The thing they loved most, the thing that defined their careers, was taken from them in 16 minutes by a man. But did they consider themselves victims? By every account, no. They considered themselves survivors who did what had to be done. 3 ordinary men who found something extraordinary inside themselves when everything depended on it. At 18,000 feet, bleeding, broken, and outnumbered by a man who had nothing to lose, they refused to give up. And that refusal saved not just their own lives, but potentially hundreds of lives on the ground below. But the event forged an unbreakable bond between them. In May of 1994, all 3 received the Airline Pilots Association Gold Medal Award for heroism. It is the highest honor a civilian pilot can receive. They remained close friends for the rest of their lives. The entire fight lasted approximately 16 minutes. From Callaway's first hammer strike at 3:26 p.m. to Sanders landing the aircraft at 3:42 p.m. 16 minutes of combat at 18,000 feet in a 160-ton cargo freighter traveling at speeds no DC-10 was ever designed to reach. Fought by 3 men with fractured skulls, severed arteries, and a body going paralyzed in real time. And none of it would have happened if one crew hadn't gone 60 seconds over their shift the day before. 1 minute of overtime. That's the margin between a hijacking and a catastrophe. Between 3 heroes and a death toll nobody wants to imagine. This is how a desperate father's insurance scheme became the most violent hijacking in American aviation history. How 3 wounded men fought a black belt at 18,000 feet, and how 60 seconds of overtime saved everyone on the ground below. To this day, FedEx Flight 705 remains the most violent hijacking in American commercial aviation history. The only reason it is remembered as a hijacking instead of a catastrophe is because one crew exceeded their daily allowed flight time by 60 seconds the day before. If that crew had landed 1 minute earlier, Callaway would have been the flight engineer on duty. He would have been alone in the cockpit with his original crew of 2, a captain and a first officer, not 3 trained men. And at 6'2", armed with hammers and a black belt in martial arts, the outcome would almost certainly have been different. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe and activate the bell button so you can receive new videos.